So we're going to jump into the second section now of why Safe to Tell was created. And so there's kind of 6 different reasons here. I'll go into each of these in detail here about the 6 overall reasons for that, all right? So reason number 1 is, as I mentioned, because the data shows most of the time students knew information or had concerns and didn't tell, Safe to Tell is anonymous. And so this is from that study I mentioned that was in the bottom left corner there, the National Threat Assessment Study. What they found is in evidence of planned school attacks, instances of planned school attacks, 77% of the time, so almost all of those school attacks, somebody other than the bad guy knew about it, had information that it was going to happen, and failed to tell anybody what they knew. Isn't that crazy? I'm going to repeat that again just so that I think that sinks in for your audience, right? So the vast majority of planned school attacks that we've had, 77%, right? Somebody other than the bad guy had concerns. So whether they saw like a drawing or a plan or overheard a comment or something like that, right? I think very legitimate concerns, and failed to report what they knew. I think that's absolutely a startling statistic. So then they looked and they said, okay, what's the relationship of that person who knew? This is the bottom number. You can kind of read the other ones if you want. But that bottom number there, they said, what's the relationship that person that knew to the bad guy? Was it a parent? Was it a coach? Was it a teacher? And you can see that most of those people who had concerns and didn't tell somebody were kids and peers. Yeah. And so and we can go through all the different reasons why it's hard to tell, like, because they're afraid that the bad guy will get at them, or they didn't think it was real, or they didn't know who to tell, or they didn't want to be a snitch, or sometimes it's like really hard to tell. And so one of, I think, the important lessons learned and the takeaway here, for parents and for adults and for teachers is we often position ourselves to be like people in authority of trust, and our kids can tell us everything, but you can see from the data that they don't. And so that's why we have Safe to Tell is one of the key messages for kids is, hey, go talk to your trusted adult first, whoever that is, whether it's you as a parent, or whether that's the counselor or the teacher. But if that's too hard, you still have a duty to tell, because you know things before us, and we can't help unless we know that there's a problem. And so you can anonymously report through Safe to Tell. One other statistic for you that I thought was really interesting, and this has probably changed since that study came out in 2018, but only 17% of those schools that had a planned school attack in that time period, from Virginia Tech 2008 to Parkland in 2018, 17% had an anonymous tip line. So the vast majority of them, the kids either had to suck it up and tell someone, or suck it up and hope it kind of went away.
Wow.
All right, so I already mentioned this, but as we said, so that's the first reason it's anonymous, is because kids know things and we want to reach out from them. They kind of go further, right? So you can extrapolate that kids are uncomfortable sometimes talking to adults, and that's why Safe to Tell is anonymous. This is a survey I'll also send to you, Kristina. This is called the Healthy Colorado Kids Survey. And so a lot of different schools take it around. And this was kind of startling. They asked, how many, do you have a trusted adult? And most of the students said, yep, I've got a trusted adult. And then they asked, I think, a more challenging follow-up question here of how likely are you to talk to that trusted adult when you feel sad yourself for 2 weeks? And you can see that less than half of our high school kiddos disclosed that. This is just conjecture from me, not in the data. But I think sometimes a lot of students are afraid of like letting us down as adults to say that they're struggling, because they have a lot of pressure to be perfect, right, on social media and be perfect with their friends and get A's. And there's a lot of stress with that. But we do know anecdotally that kids talk to their friends, right? And kids are comfortable talking to their friends. So this is just kind of further evidence that kids know things before adults. All right. So number 3, so one of the lessons learned, kind of moving on from kids now, is after a tragedy that there's silos of information. And so law enforcement, might have known some different things. School might have known a few different things. Mental health folks might have known a few different things. Even within a building, the counselor might know something, the teacher, the principal, and nobody's sharing kind of with one another that information. And so because of that, we send all the tips simultaneously, regardless of what it is, to law enforcement in the jurisdiction and to the school, right? And that doesn't mean it's that you know, law enforcement is always going to go lights and sirens rolling on tips. But what that does mean is that if a student is bullying another student, right, and that comes through Safe to Tell, and law enforcement can say, hey, we've done you know, a few checks at that house for domestic violence. Suddenly your level of concern for that student that's bullying someone else has been raised, and you can more effectively kind of intervene with that student. So what that means is, so at Safe to Tell here, we're kind of the conduit of information from the tipster to get to the local folks, right? But the local folks are your school folks, your district folks, your school resource officers. They know the kids a lot better than we do. And so they're actually the ones that investigate and follow up on the tips and support students and close out that action, right? We don't actually do any of the investigation or any of those things ourselves. And I think that's an important distinction, because sometimes folks kind of aren't happy with like the outcome of a tip, and they want us to do something different. And we have to say, hey, use whatever escalation at your school is from there. But anyway, long story short, what this just means is that us at the state and then local partners and law enforcement and schools, like everybody's getting all the same information at the same time. And then within our platform, they can coordinate all of their responses. Okay. So this is, I think, something that parents are kind of used to sometimes when there's disciplinary action or something else about another child. And because of privacy, the school can't share it or can't disclose that. And that's kind of the same thing with Safe to Tell, right? Our goal is to really end the code of silence amongst kids, which is kids know things and didn't report it. So because of that, Safe to Tell is anonymous. So in the tip intake that we have, there's no caller ID. There's no like IP trace. It just says tipster on it. And if a student might say like, I'm worried about my sister, Sally, and they send that to us at Safe to Tell, we'll scrub out the my sister, because that would identify you as the tipster. And instead it'll just say tipster's worried about Sally. On the back end, that also means that the tip contents aren't like disclosed. And so if a tipster shares like a Snapchat picture, right? Or shares a text message exchange of a conversation, and we turned around and said, hey, tell me about this text message, the person that we're talking to might be able to figure out who that tipster was. And so instead, the conversation, we coach schools to look something like, hey, we've been really, concerned about you lately, or we've heard that you've been having a hard time, or, we heard that you might be suicidal. Tell me what's going on, rather than saying, we got a Safe to Tell tip about you and here's what it is. And because those kids have relationships with the school resource officer and the counselor and those other folks, that goes over a lot easier than just us at Safe to Tell calling them for it. So just as we mentioned here, Safe to Tell, we're kind of the one-stop shop for tips. And so the messaging for parents and then the messaging for kids is, hey, if your desire is to protect, prevent, or help, send it in. Don't worry about whether it's real or not. Don't worry about whether it's too small or not, or insignificant or not, right? Just send it in. We'll do the back-end legwork, and our school partners will also do the back-end legwork. But we'd rather get 100 tips that turn out to be no big deal than one that we could have really done something to make a difference in a child's life. On the flip side, and I'll get into this when we talk about students a little bit more, but sometimes students and tipsters kind of think anonymous, and they hear that like they don't know who it is. And rather than turning a tip to help, they'll turn in a tip to kind of hurt, harass, bully, get somebody in trouble, kind of make something up. And our tipsters, our local partners report it's only about 2.5% of our tips that are identified in this fashion. But I think it's really important for those kids to understand the why. As I mentioned, Safe to Tell is anonymous because it's hard to tell, but we want you to tell, right? It's not anonymous to mess around on. And I think if kids understand that we want to hear from them, we want to protect from them, we have this outlet, I find most of the time kids respond to that and rise to the challenge to use it appropriately. As I mentioned here, certainly don't want to second guess from your tips. Always err on the side of sending it in. So a quick distinction, this is kind of a definition for us that's really important. In a similar way that I think kids or even sometimes parents interchange typical peer conflict and bullying, and there's like a really big difference between the two of those. There's kind of a really big difference here between on the outcome of an unfounded tip and like a false tip. And so unfounded tip would be like little to no evidence that there's a concern, but that's still viewed as like a really good tip. A false tip is where we said that there's actually evidence that someone is bullying and harassing, right? So putting it in terms like an unfounded thing might be like normal peer conflict, right? That somebody's not bullying someone, but you're equal in that, and that's a normal part of life. False tip, somebody's hurting them. So here's an example of an unfounded. So tipster posts this on their Instagram, and they just say, hey, I'm not going to be here tomorrow. I just wanted to say bye. And a tipster takes a screenshot and turns that into Safe to Tell and says, hey, I'm really worried that Jane Doe is going to be suicidal. So we follow it, send that to the school team. The school counselor talks to her, and she finds out it was a misunderstanding, and she says, I'm just moving. I probably should have said something different, but I'm not feeling suicidal, right? So even though the outcome wasn't somebody who was suicidal, it's still a fantastic tip because somebody saw something and decided to speak up, and that's what we want. And again, that's the heart and the reason of the program. And then again, as we said, false tip, there's kids that are using it to mess around.